Today, my guest is David Cassidy. He's a vice president at TCG and a proud immigrant to America, and somebody I've got to know over the years, at least the last 5 or 6, David. It's crazy that time flies. And so thank you for joining me today on this podcast.
Sure thing. Happy to be here.
So for those who haven't met you, had a chance to chat with you in the hallways and catch up about things going on in your life, talk a bit about your background, where you're from, who you are and what you do.
Sure. So whenever I do any kind of interview or presentation or whatever, the very first thing I say is I have an accent. And if I talk too quickly, tell me to slow down, because sometimes, even though I've been here 20 something years, I go a little too quick for the American ear. So as people watching the podcast will know, by this point, I'm from South Africa. No, I'm not. I'm from the United Kingdom and born and raised in England. But I'm the only person in my family that sounds like this.
Oh, wow.
Everybody else is from Ireland, from County Donegal on the West Coast. So, Irish genes, English born and raised, and then moved to America in my 20s because of my darling wife, who is born and raised in New York. And so we met online, actually, back in the Wild West of the internet, back in like 1995, 96.
AOL days.
AOL days, yeah, exactly. So I was in the lab at my university. She was in the lab at her university, and we met on a Usenet group, and then eventually met in person in Boston, and then sparks flew and so forth. But anyway, so we got married and then ended up moving over here after that and settled in the DC area. So these days, I run business development and large programs for TCG, which is a government IT contractor, an emerging large business, I think is what they're called these days. And in that role, I get to meet wonderful people like you, Jeremy.
So rolling back a little bit.
Yeah.
How did you get started in your career? What was your path? Was it? I know in England it's a different education system. So
yeah.
What does that look like for you?
Sure. So my dad, my mom and my dad, they both came from Donegal in Ireland, and they moved to England in the 60s. And then several years later, I popped along. Now, when they came over, they were working, my dad was a bus driver, my mom was a bus conductor, the people like you see with the tickets and all that on the bus. And that was fine and good and great, but my dad always had this ambition to start his own business. And so he did. With a friend, he started his own business making picture frames, fine art frames, and then large-scale manufacturing of those same art products and so forth. So eventually he had a factory and ran it with my mum, and all of that was great. And I think that kind of instilled in me the idea that the entrepreneurial spirit is something that can make great changes in a family's existence, but also in the communities around them. So my dad employed a bunch of people, and watching him be the owner of a business and being the person who was helping his employees, not just with jobs, but in other areas of their lives, it kind of taught me a lot about the power of business and the power of being able to create these entities that could do a lot of good. They could produce really wonderful products, but more than that, they could just do good in the world. Mm-hmm. So when I went to, when I left school, I took a year out between our version of high school and college. And in that year, I started a business with some friends. And that business was focused on the development of computer games. There was a new console emerging at the time called the Commodore Amiga CD32. Which was going to be the next big thing, you see, after the Sega Mega Drive. And so we were all Commodore Amiga nuts. And so we started this company to develop these games, but then they canceled the console. And so we're like, well, now we have all this infrastructure and we have no idea what to do with it. So we started to distribute public domain software. So if you think about open source software now, back then it was called public domain. And there was no way to get it because the internet didn't exist, except on bulletin boards and stuff like that. So we were the intermediary. There was an arbitrage opportunity, as I now know it. And so we would put everything on floppy disks, and then we'd mail them all over the world. And so we ran this company. It was called Synostic. And it was very successful for about 2 years. And then we turned it into a bulletin board kind of host and stuff like that. But by that point, I was in college. Now, in the UK, it's very different than in the US. In the US, you go to college and you're like, oh, I'm here for a year and I have no idea what I want to be or do or whatever. And you can kind of figure it out and do this kind of like buffet style education thing, which I think is great. But in the UK, when you apply to college, you're like, I want to be a whatever. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a surgeon. I want to be a lawyer. And so you go and you get trained in college specifically around that skill. And having seen the power of business and having run a business and actively running a business, I chose to do management science. And so as my kids remind me, management isn't a science, Dad. And we have that argument all the time, particularly with my wife, who has, she's an anthropologist by training. And ironically, she has a Bachelor of Arts and I have a Bachelor of Science. And so I hold that over her every single dinner time. Anyway, so I did the management science thing. And then at college, during college, I met my wife and I left college and joined a consulting firm as an engineer. So I got my NetWare certifications, I got my Microsoft certifications, and I was going around doing help desk and network engineering stuff. And then I pivoted into solutions engineering and architecture. So we were putting together some of the first solutions around MS Exchange and deploying all the new technologies that Microsoft was coming out with at the time. And then we decided to move to America. And it was then I could kind of wipe the slate clean and say, okay, what do I want to do now? Mm. And I realized that what I really loved doing was organizing people and stuff to achieve bigger outcomes. So that was really a project management role. So when we moved to the US, we chose DC just because it seemed right. Like we'd lived in Philadelphia for a while when my wife was in college. We'd lived in Boston for a while. I'd been in San Francisco for a while before that. Didn't want to be in Florida because I already see enough English soccer shirts in my everyday life. And so DC seemed like the right place. So having come to DC, that was the opportunity to say, okay, what could I do that would be really awesome? And so working for a technology company, because at that time, technology in the US was far ahead of where, web technology in particular was far ahead of where the UK was. And working in the public sector seemed like a really good match. And after working for a short period at Borders Books just to pay some bills, I found TCG, and that was in 2000. And so I've been at TCG since then. But I joined as a project manager.
Wow.
And running programs and projects at the NIH, building grants management systems, patents reporting systems. We did some calendaring stuff. And then the dot-com boom happened and everything was great. And then we worked on some dot-com stuff, and then it was really bad. And the dot-com stuff fell in on itself like a flan in a cupboard. And then Dan, who owns the company, Dan Turner, he said, well, look, we need to find some new work. And it would be great if you, Dave, could go do that. And I asked him why. And he said, well, for some reason, people enjoy talking with you. I don't understand why personally, but they seem to. We think we can give you like 12 months to kind of figure it out. And so I didn't really want to do it, to be honest with you. I had in my head this idea that salespeople were a particular kind of person, that their job was to get the best deal possible for their company while giving the customer the worst deal possible for the customer. Give as little as possible and get as much out of the transaction as possible. Right. And so I didn't want to operate that way. I didn't like thinking of myself as that kind of person. But what Dan and I talked about was, well, look, go do the job as you think the job should be done, and see if it works out. So he said we had about 12 months. And the reason we had 12 months is because after the dot-com collapse, our company shrank. So the TCG had gotten up to about 35 people-ish at that point. But we were going down, right? Because work was shedding. One of our big contracts at the NIH got taken over by the Prime, who was not inclined to keep us on board. And at that time, we were 100% offsite. We were in a 100% virtual organization, and they wanted everybody on site. So we shrank down to about 7 people. And so we had about 12 months to get new work. Otherwise, we're going to have to shut the company down. So we started doing that work, and I started investing in the areas that I felt the company was really good in. And the company was really strong in web applications technology. But then coming up to like 2003, that was very commoditized. Everyone was doing web applications technology. So we pivoted into looking at the business of government, and the things that we were really good at that no one else was as good at were things around federal grants management in particular, and building systems to support that. So we kind of hit that fairly relentlessly. And eventually in month, I think it was 13 of our 12, we won a contract at the USDA, and that allowed us to hire a few people. And then from there, everything kind of just kept going. And so I've been doing this role since then. And now my role is quite different because it's a much bigger company and much bigger portfolio of work. So that's how I ended up doing what I'm doing. Now, one of your questions, Jeremy, is probably going to be, so how was it that your role was different? How did you do it differently from the idea that you had about salespeople?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the perfect follow-on question. Thank you for teeing that
You're
up.
welcome. It's the question I ask myself every day. It's actually a very simple answer. I see project management as being puzzle solving. Every day we're presented with a set of criteria, a set of constraints. You must achieve these outcomes within this budget using those resources. And you can balance all of those things together with the risks and the change management and so forth. And so it's this puzzle that we're constantly calibrated against, or calibrating toward, if you will. Sales and business development is no different to that at all. In business development, we talk about the organizational goals that we have. We talk about the budget that might be available. We talk about the technical constraints that exist in that environment, people's preferences and predilections towards certain companies and entities and approaches and so forth. It's just a big puzzle. So once I started to see business development as a puzzle and figuring it out and turning it into a game almost, that's how it was different to me. And the way in which my father taught me how to treat business really played into that really well, because one of the outcomes wasn't just what does the organization get out of this, but also what do the people get out of it? What do our employees get out of this? What do our customers, stakeholders get out of this? How does this benefit the taxpayer? And now it's a really complicated puzzle. Now it's a really fun puzzle, and it's a fun puzzle with really beneficial outcomes for everyone. I'm not getting more out of it than anybody else is getting out of it. TCG isn't getting out of it anything more than the customer's getting out of it. And it's a very balanced way of working. And so that's how we do business development here at TCG today. Wow,
that is a different approach. And it certainly takes some of, I think, that I'm here to just sell you something, right? Away from it, makes it more conversational, makes it more interactive. Right. I like it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it makes it more complicated.
Well, definitely more complicated.
And it means that the company's growth has been slower than perhaps we could have otherwise achieved. But our organization has a very strong set of core values, and we calibrate our work against those core values fairly relentlessly. And we hold ourselves accountable for how we operate. Which isn't to say that companies that grow quickly are doing anything unethical. Quite the opposite. They're probably just doing what we're doing, but better. But this is how we choose to work and deliver a particular kind of experience for employees and also to our clients.
So you've been around the block, David, not just at TCG, but before that as well. And it does sound like you've already maybe even addressed some of the things that you yourself have seen that could be done better. But is there more work we can do in that area? Is there something you've observed, over your career that if you had the ability to change or, at least bring up and get people to start thinking about it, what's something that you would, consider or have us consider?
Sure. So I am an immigrant to the US, and I am very, very grateful and fairly emotional about the fact that this country has welcomed me in the way that it has. Now, because I sound like a British person, people don't think of me as an immigrant, but that is what I am. And I come from a long line of them. My grandfather moved to the US back in the 30s and then had to move back to Ireland. And my great-grandfather on my mother's side came here and ended up dying in Ohio within 6 months. So we've been trying to get here this whole time. So I'm particularly grateful for what the country has done for me and my family, and the ability for my wife and I to have a family here. And the reason I mention that is because I think there's a huge underappreciation of what the federal government does for this country and for the world more broadly, but focusing on just American interests and American interests alone. When we look around ourselves, we're surrounded by what the federal government does in the roads that are built, in the clean air that we breathe, in the water that we drink, the pharmaceuticals that we take to keep ourselves healthy, the food that we eat every day that is nutritious and safe, the electricity, which is powering this very conversation. All of these things are not because of the federal government, but the quality of that, their reliability, is down to public administration. And I think one of the things which is undervalued in America at the moment, and I would argue in many countries too, but particularly in America right now, is the vital nature of the government's operations to how we live every day, to the way in which we assume we can get up in the morning and we can go to bed at night, and we can be safe, and we can have our power, we can have our food and our water, and we can fly places and all that kind of thing. And the reason I bring that up is because often in conversations about what we do in our business, there's this thing about, well, why can't the federal government just operate more like a business? There are a million reasons why the federal government should never operate like a business. And so it puts the government in a position of its work being undervalued, right? It's very easy to see the bottom line of an Apple or a Tesla or whoever, Amazon.com, in the numbers that they produce. We don't have that as part of the federal government. So when we are trying to value the work that we do as contractors on behalf of our government clients, I often try and look to what is the social benefit, what is the net benefit to the taxpayer of this effort and what we're doing. For a while at TCG, we had a metric, a big, hairy, audacious goal, a BHAG, of saving the saving US taxpayers $1 billion by improving the way the government works. And we hit that goal back in 2016. But the reason we set that goal was to try and put a metric around it. And what we found was so hard about it was that it was difficult to calculate financial benefit to US taxpayers, because the things that we experience really don't have a price. The safety of my children when they go to school is priceless to me. The safety of the medications that we take is priceless to all of us. And so one thing I wish we had, if I could change anything, would be some framework through which we could measure and demonstrate the value of the federal government to our country, because that would make our lives as contractors so much more easily communicable as valuable. And within that, there comes that other element, and I think this is something which is missing just within our business in government contractors as a whole, is bonds of trust between clients and contractors are really hard to build and incredibly easy to break. It takes a long time to get them to get relationships to a point where we can have an open conversation about tough stuff. And I would hope that with movements towards things like the Agile Manifesto and open conversations and those kinds of things, more of us could experience more of that trust building every day in our conversations with each other as contractors and also with each other as clients and vendors.
Do you think some of the difficulty there is, I mean, the government, when we put our regulations in place, we don't necessarily think about those second or third interactions that come about because we put a policy in place?
Yeah.
Do you think some of that is so we're not intentionally trying to put policy in place that builds trust between us and us, meaning me and the federal government and companies like yours? In fact, we do everything we can to not have that built. right? Because we try to build these relationships that are not relationships, that have a
Right.
separation of some sort, which makes it difficult to do business, as you said, right? You need to build those trusts. So I mean, from that perspective, there's probably more work to be done in how our contract law perceives those type of relationships.
I think that there's I think that a lot of the FAR, for example, you know, for even now, the FAR prefers firm fixed price work. Right. And that would be okay if we could have open conversations where failure was an okay thing to encounter. Right. Like if I as a vendor commit to a price and then I come to a client and I say, you know, we've encountered this problem. If the reaction to that is, I don't care, you're going to deliver it for the same price. Right. Now, all of a sudden, there's an incentive for me to be less open about those problems. That's something we don't want. We don't want that. Now, in our company, we have a core value. We are fair, honest, and open. We will always give the bad news, always. But there is that incentive built into the FAR. So I think there are some changes there. And we've seen some of this with some of the, like the digital services playbook talks about, don't do firm fixed price. Right. Because that's really hard. Do T&M because that gives room for negotiation. But even in that, there is then a need for that negotiation to be fair, honest, and open. Like if the government says, we're changing direction, we want a little bit of a different requirement, contractors should not be change ordering that client to death. There needs to be an exchange. Mm-hmm. And it's only through those moments where we have vulnerability. Just like any relationship, you know, in a marriage or a friendship or whatever, when you are vulnerable, that's when you build trust. And the FAR, I think, sometimes goes too far in trying to eliminate the government's vulnerability and putting all the risk on the contractor. And as a relationship mechanism, that's not going to work.
Well, I think some of it is always not also the contractor either, right? Sometimes the FAR is trying to eliminate risk from bad government employees. Mm-hmm. Who don't want to do their job or do the part of it they're supposed to be responsible for. Otherwise, we could do a lot of like cost plus contracts, right? Cost plus contracts require a lot of effort on a government employee's part to manage and follow through and ensure things are done in such a way. And that's why we don't have them, right? It's a lot of effort.
It is. That is certainly true. I mean, in my experience of working for and with the US federal government for the last 20 something years, the most, the projects that have had the highest levels of customer satisfaction and the least contentiousness have been T&M contracts where a client has been very willing to hold us to account and vice versa. Mm-hmm. When that happens, there is a magic that occurs. And it does require matching philosophies of how one works, right? Yeah. And what my dad taught me is it very much resonates within what I just said. You need to have strong-willed but open collaborators in order to build stuff and to deliver stuff. If it becomes adversarial, you're on a bad path at that point.
Yeah, and probably on a path where the relationship's not going to last.
Well, or it will, but it will tend to be not as fruitful as it might have been. I mean, you know, there are lots of great contracts we've had that have been firm fixed price, and we've delivered some really tremendous things. And I don't want to diminish those at all. But I look back and think, if that was T&M, we could have done that one thing just a little more, because we would have had money in the budget to do that. We wouldn't have had to mitigate our risk quite as much. Mm-hmm. Because we would have been able to take maybe another 2 or 3 steps. And I'm sure the same is true from the government end of things. But risk mitigation is also important. It is worth paying money to mitigate risk. Absolutely. So I see it. It's just I wish, you know, if I had my druthers, Jeremy, that would be one of the things I would hope that we could overcome, is to have a bit more trust building earlier in relationships, generally speaking.
That's a good one. So David, where do you see yourself, or where do you see this work you're doing with TCG? Where are you heading? What's the horizon look like for you guys?
Right. Good question. So TCG is an emerging large business. Later this year, we will be that dreaded other than small. And so probably, if the numbers all shake out. And as a consequence, you know, we've been putting into place some of the things that we think are important, right? Like joint ventures and getting all of our accreditations, getting all of our systems in place and all of that kind of stuff. More importantly, one of the things that we did a couple of years ago was we became a certified B Corp, or benefit corporation. Now, a benefit corporation or a B Corp is an organization that is committed to the communities around the organization. So employees, the environment, sustainability, those sorts of goals. And it is a legal entity type, and we are held to account for those measures. So, for example, we have solar panels on the roof of the office. We're one of the great places to work in the United States. We are a top workplace, all of those kinds of things, because of how we treat our employees. Right. And the ways in which we work, one of the things that we want to do as an organization is to help others not make the same mistakes we did in getting to where we are. And building these really robust government contractor and other types of organizations that can do great work for the public good and give back to their environments and ensure their employees have a great experience and ensure their clients are 100% satisfied, as TCG's clients have been over the last 27 years, literally 100%. And so that's one of the things the organization is trying to do. On a personal front, what I'm interested in doing is helping organizations encounter difficulties and see them as puzzles, and to solve them by the use of things like core values, by solving them by the use of things like an agile approach to how we do business internally and how we organize ourselves, in terms of seeing the opportunities that exist in the marketplace for accelerating growth. Because ultimately that's where my passion is ensuring that more people get to work with us and we get to work with more people. And so being able to encounter organizations that are at a stage of saying, you know what, we think we have something here, and being able to help them accelerate their development, that's where I get really jazzed. In terms of the two entities, myself and TCG, and how we're aligned, I see us as an organization that's going to hopefully continue to win large contracts, hopefully continue to keep our clients really, really happy, and grow a company where people want to come and work. Because right now we are an employer of choice in the DC area, and we want that to continue as a larger business. So that's how I see those things playing.
Those are great goals, and keep doing it. You guys are doing a great job.
Yeah, thanks.
So, well, David, I want to thank you for joining me on the podcast today. This has been a great conversation. It's been great to reconnect with you since it's been a while. COVID's getting in the way, but I look forward to future conversations.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure.